Hello and welcome to State of Play on Mint Press News, a bi-weekly geopolitical news show hosted by myself, Greg Stoker, former U.S. Army Ranger with a background in special operations and human intelligence. I'm resending that bio because this will be more of a military strategic episode, and I used to be plugged into establishment thinking, which I will furnish you with in the intro. We're going to be talking about the ceasefire in Lebanon, and we have two amazing guests for you. Real quick, the seasons just turned here in Texas. I have horrible allergies right now, and we're doing this live, so I may accidentally cough. My eyes might be bloodshot. I might look ridiculously high, but I promise you, the audience, that I am. Anyways, Mint Press is a small, independent newsroom devoid of any corporate sponsors. If you're picking up what we're putting down, consider supporting us on Patreon. If you're getting smothered by late-stage finance capitalism, we get it. We're just glad you're here. Anyways, you hear that, editor? Allergies. Anyways, let's get started. Many of you out there are confused by the sudden ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah in Southern Lebanon, given that one of Hezbollah's initial early operational imperatives was to not relent its military pressure on Israel until a ceasefire was reached in Gaza. That prospect, one of a ceasefire, seems more unlikely now from certain perspectives, though some hold out hope that this ceasefire in Lebanon will snowball into others throughout the region. With the IDF on the brink, low on munitions and manpower, why relent now? So conventional military wisdom, what we would call doctrinal establishment thinking, holds that this acceptance from a strictly strategic perspective is an enormous mistake by Hezbollah and the entire axis of resistance. The general terms of the ceasefire being: all military infrastructure and positions will be dismantled, all unauthorized weapons confiscated. A committee will be established that is acceptable to Israel and Lebanon, which will monitor and assist in enforcing these commitments. Israel and Lebanon will report any possible violation of the commitments of the committee to UNIFIL and that said committee. Lebanon will deploy its security forces along all borders, crossing points, and the line that defines the southern region shown in its deployment plan. Israel will then withdraw and consolidate its forces in a phased manner south of the blue line in a period of 60 days, and the U.S. will promote indirect negotiations between Israel and Lebanon to reach a recognized land border. Indeed, there's much wariness about the campaign of U.S. influence in Lebanon and the Lebanese government, typified by the construction of this new 43-acre American fortress embassy in Beirut. So, turning to Israel, Netanyahu answered the question, why establish a ceasefire now? And there are three main reasons he gave. First, to focus on the threat of Iran, which he refused to explain. Second, to rearm, resupply, and renew the IDF, as it is no secret that the Israeli defense apparatus is low on munitions, men, and morale. Third, to separate the fronts and isolate Hamas and other resistant networks in Gaza from the axis of resistance. And in short, Israel seems to be buying time to replenish its military, both in terms of firepower and manpower, and to wait for an even more pliable U.S. administration. Trump. Additionally, the ceasefire separates resistance fronts, permitting the IDF to eventually defeat the Palestinian resistance by the only means possible, the complete ethnic cleansing of northern Gaza. Also, this provides them with requisite time to organize against a wider axis, the wider axis and Iran as they perceive it. So, anyways, that was a lot, I know, but that's the conventional thinking about this. And tonight, we are going to explore alternative, maybe more reasonable interpretation of events. And to that end, we are joined on State of Play by Lebanese journalist and war correspondent Ghadi Francis and Batool Subeiti, energy engineer and political analyst based in the United Kingdom. Many of the audience, I'm sure, are familiar with y'all. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having us.
So my first question for you, Ghadi, why accept this deal now, given that the IDF is stretched to capacity? We've heard reporting in the Washington Post saying this as of yesterday, which is a newspaper typically sympathetic towards them. Is there any internal pressures happening? What do you think we need to know?
Allow me first, Greg, to put some insights on your monologue, which was very important, and it's setting the standards and the talk and the conversation now. It is only logic to read that ceasefire, to read into the details of the paper like that if you're analyzing them.
Mhm.
If it was by the book, and if really any international law or treaty or United Nations or humanitarian law or any diplomatic kind of solving wars was respected during the past year. And if that paper or ceasefire deal was really built on something that wasn't even there before the war, which is 1701, and it is actually taking Israel to where it was. Now, when we narrate parts of that deal, talking about the security forces in Lebanon and what the Americans would do, and south of Litani and north of Litani, and these details, we have a saying in Lebanese and in Arabic in general. It says, "The devil is in the details." So now, when we narrate part of the details without the others, this ceasefire deal might look like something which it actually isn't, because on the ground in Lebanon, there was a 1701 for the past more than a decade, and it was the time where Hezbollah was able to build that capacity that was able to showcase itself on the ground of South Lebanon to deter and to hit hard. So in general, the paper, the ceasefire deal, does not really set the standard where we can actually study the status quo or where strategically we actually are now military-wise. And given your veteran experience, I'd like to give you some points in general, which are information from the ground of South Lebanon. They're very important for military analysis, and they would be used in this conversation. We were looking at the videos about these southernmost borderline villages, right? And we're seeing the Israeli troops marching inside with the flags and the tanks, right?
Yes.
But they didn't even remain there for even hours in any of these shots and videos. And this was coming after 8 weeks of ground invasion with all kinds of ammunition and help, and after a year of attacking from afar, and it was all around kilometers in the southernmost borderline of Lebanon. So on the ground, the actual plan that the Israelis had to eradicate, to confiscate, to end Hezbollah did not happen, and the losses were big. And the rockets that Netanyahu said were destroyed emerged in Tel Aviv just a few days before that ceasefire deal, and so on. So in general, I don't believe in papers as a Lebanese person who has. I've always heard about 1559, 425, 742. We hear a lot about treaties and ceasefires and deals, but on the ground, I mean, if anything has been taught to us and reassured to our like general knowledge and awareness today, is that any narrative that comes in the mainstream media and from diplomacy and from officials, that's probably not the truth. We really have to look at the ground. On the ground today, the Lebanese people were back in their southernmost villages. People are sleeping today in their homes in Farkila, where the Israelis said they occupied, and the Israeli settlers are not back in the northern areas. I think this is also something strategic and military and good to analyze when discussing that ceasefire deal. What do you think?
Absolutely. And for the record, I just want to say that I brought up those points because there are plenty of policymakers in Washington that just read the paper and see a victory here. And I think the furthest that I've tracked through open source like intelligence would be like one special forces team got like 3.2 kilometers in coming from Metula towards like the Litani River, stayed for a couple hours and they went back. And of course, the Guardian newspaper picked it up and said they had done like complex operations deep inside Hezbollah territory, which is utterly false and completely false. So, um, do you? Why do you think now the ceasefire was accepted then?
Because they couldn't take it anymore, because we can look at the losses, and because maybe now there is the time, exactly like you eloquently stated, it is a time for them to recollect their breath, their ammunitions, their morale, their economy, their crumbling society, their local and domestic problems, their frustrations, and their failures to deliver anything to the Israelis. I think they're trying to make use of that time to catch their breath. And the losses, I'm always saying this today, but it's good to say it to your viewers as well, Greg. Um, for Israel, it's when you have the same law doesn't apply to everything. I mean, in life, every tree, every plant, every entity has its own law. So now, when you want to talk about rules of defeat and victory, for Israelis, for an Israeli entity, this that carries people from around the world on the safe refuge kind of brainwashing propaganda, for them to listen to 500 times sirens in Tel Aviv, it is an existential defeat. It is a dismantling of the idea. So it's not something very easy. When Hezbollah was able to do that after killing and assassinating all their leaders, as per the Israelis, after doing the pager attack, like directly hitting 5,000 fighters, according to the reports, the military of Hezbollah, they show us these fighters without fingers, without eyes, which is the pager targets, firing these rockets at Tel Aviv. So talk about morale. So this is another front where they were actually victorious over the Israelis and the people that came back to the south. I mean, this is also existential, because this fight, the perspective in actually measuring wins or losses for everyone, no matter on which side of history you chose to be. You can have different perspectives, but this is a war against indigenous people. As long as the people are remaining here, are rooted here, are coming back within hours. I mean, Afikhai Adra, told the people, don't go back to the south, the war is not over. What was their response? They were, hours later, they were back in the south. They don't trust them, they don't care about them, they don't fear them. On the other side, we will wait and see when would the Israelis go back to the northern occupied Palestine. We will wait and we will see.
Yeah. Also, it's worth mentioning that Canadian work visas have been issued at a 5 times rate this year to Israeli citizens. So that's also worth noting. Finally, I just wanted to touch on one more like Western, I guess, mainstream media talking point that I grew up with fighting the unfortunately named global war on terror, which was completely illegal and without basis. This obsession with decapitation strikes. Like, they killed Nasrallah, they killed a bunch of military commanders. And I was actually talking to an ex-4-star general about this. And it's just like, we do in professional militaries change a command ceremonies like every 12 months. And, you know, the entire hierarchy doesn't collapse. So there is this narrative that Hezbollah has been completely dismantled, diminished, and degraded, and it will take them 10 years, I think I read in a Haaretz op-ed, to regain their capabilities. So
actually, I think it says two things.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, it says why these groups were able to become stronger and stronger with time. Mm-hmm. Because the empire that is fighting them till date doesn't know their ideology. How can you beat someone if you don't really know how they think? With all your intelligence, do you really understand these people's ideologies? You are remaking a Karbala. You are rebranding everyone to be a revolutionary by killing their father, their neo-Hussein figure. So what they did is not only to reassure people on their passion and their ideology, which always brings them to the radical martyrdom display of heroic resistance. They don't care if they die. They have an ideology. They don't care if they fight till their last breath. It's different from paid armies, you know. And as per the hierarchy, the West has been racist enough to us people. They think that we don't have the capacity to think and organize military. They think we're like, we don't know. So maybe they kill our tribal leader and we are dismantled. They don't understand that brown people, that Oriental people, that Lebanese men do educate themselves enough to be able to manufacture drones. They cannot look at us like that, so they cannot defeat us also. So you have two things. First of all, they don't understand the ideology. Second of all, the supremacy blinds them. You see $1 billion Iron Dome supremacy being beaten by Hassan La'is's kids and students. Who is Hassan La'is? He's a villager from Beqa. He's a physical scientist as well, who learned and built these drones. So they couldn't really acknowledge that our people are strong enough to learn how to fight them back. And this is also part of why our people became stronger.
Yeah. I mean, the case in point why Orientalism is bad for the imperialists as well. It just blinds you to racism and stuff. Anyways, I know that this is your fourth interview today and it's late over there in Lebanon. I just wanted to thank you so much for coming on, Ghadi Francis. We really appreciate it.
I want to thank you for making me share a screen with Batool, whom I really respect. And thank you, Greg, for giving the time to learn and to teach about what's happening. Best regards to all of you and to your viewers.
Thanks so much. All right, thank you for waiting so patiently. So we
very eloquent from Ghadi.
Yeah, so we could get her commentary. So, Batool, what does this mean? Given that there's a definite disparity on the ground between policy in Washington and in Tel Aviv, within the Israeli government, between policy in Washington and what's actually going to play out on the ground with their myopic vision of trying to institute Resolution 1701, which didn't work in the first place, but now that's what's going to maintain a ceasefire. Do you see this ceasefire, which is supposed to last for 60 days, actually lasting 60 days?
Right. So I think the first thing that I'll start off with, and this is sort of just echoing what Ghadi was saying, and that is that the Israeli occupation entity is the one that's desperate to end the war. This ceasefire is not Netanyahu agreeing to Resolution 1701. This ceasefire is literally an expression of Netanyahu seeking an exit from the crisis that the entity is finding itself in, as she explained. A collapsing army, a paralyzed northern Israeli occupation, and that coming into the heart of the entity as well. So Haifa becoming the new Kiryat Shmona, the resistance abilities to literally target Tel Aviv and like the Gush Dan area. Like, you're talking about a collapse to the state's capabilities if Tel Aviv becomes like Haifa. So the point over here is that if the Israeli occupation entity was able to achieve anything in war, the last thing that Netanyahu would do is agree to a ceasefire. So all logic points to the need for Israel to have stopped this war with Lebanon. What can also be discussed is the external pressure that exists, in addition to the mounting losses, the failures. So, continuing this war, will that support Israel's objective in creating a quote unquote new Middle East? They're not going to get any stabilization in controlling any village in the south. The only outcome of this war that has been proven to us is further disturbances and further disintegration within the entity. So from Israel's strategic perspective, it has no interest to remain and to continue. And exactly as Ghadi said, 1701 becomes the excuse for the ceasefire. But then even then, Israel doesn't need an excuse to withdraw. We know that Israel unilaterally withdrew in 2000 from Lebanon. It wasn't under pressure. It was because it was becoming too harmful for it to remain in the northern front. Likewise was the case in Gaza. When they unilaterally withdrew their occupation and their settlements and then went on to besiege Gaza. But otherwise, as Ghadi said, 1701 is that ink on paper. So to answer your question, I don't expect them to stick to 1701. I expect them to break it. In actual fact, the Israeli army today announced that it decided not to reduce its forces in the southern, Lebanese border, which means, in a way, that the pressure is still relieved from Gaza, because I think 6 of its divisions or 5 of its divisions, they moved it from Gaza into the north when they signaled that green light escalation in September. But in a way, this also tells us that the occupation forces are very scared. They're scared of even their own imagination. It's like they don't want to remove their forces from the northern front. Otherwise, for them to return back to war, I don't believe that is a reality, because if Israel wanted to continue the war, they wouldn't have stopped. Netanyahu called Hochstein, asked for a ceasefire. That means they're desperate. And this was all, I think, compounded by the resistance fire that we saw on the Sunday that passed, in what I call a kind of Black Sunday for the Israeli occupation entity, where we saw strike after strike in Tel Aviv that mounted to over 50 in one day. But in a way, Israel saying that they want to keep their forces deployed in the north also kind of gives the Islamic resistance of Lebanon the kind of excuse to keep their weapons put beyond the Litani, to not implement Resolution 1701. Of course, but irrespective of this resolution, and this was something that Ghadi also mentioned, that, this was put in 2006, and we've seen that the resistance has only expanded. It's become more formidable with time. So I guess Israel, in a way, is just further legitimizing, as it does in many respects, the resistance, and vindicates it further. That's if they decide to have their, forces remaining in the south. But when the people of the south fully return back, and this is something that you also alluded to, and the occupation forces are still remaining put, then the operations can very well begin against them by the resistance if they decide to fire and to break the ceasefire rules. And they can't say a word about it, because they are the ones who are effectively defying the resolution themselves.
Yeah. And again, just like in 2006, this is finally when Israel wants to accede to a UN resolution. 'Cause I think that, if I'm remembering correctly, the ceasefire resolution that they accepted, 1701 in 2006, was like one of the first, and they did it for political cover. Now we decide to do what the UN asks of us. So it's pretty transparent
on the paper, right? Like, it's literally an ink on the paper. So they're not bound by any resolution, and that's why I keep stressing, expect them to break it. They're only bound by it if it's in their interest, and likewise, they don't even need 1701. So there doesn't have to be a resolution even in place for them to withdraw. Like, if they're sustaining losses, they themselves will unilaterally withdraw. We saw that in 2005 in Gaza. They didn't wait for a resolution. They just said, we're pulling out, because the second intifada was too much of a blow for them in terms of losses.
Yeah, and they have a very, very small tolerance for casualties. I've noticed over the years. So, yeah, okay, so we have this piece of paper. It's not going to be followed, which makes the entire proposition of a ceasefire tenuous at best. So I guess the Cradle Media coined this interesting term. I believe it was based off a Iranian proverb, like boiling the Israeli frog. They have a very very small threshold for any sort of pressure, because Israel's a country that doesn't have a lot of strategic depth. There's not a lot of standoff between the front lines and its industrial centers, its water desalination plants. It's pretty vulnerable. Also, it's small, and it needs to be propped up by the United States. There's a lot of, and we talk a lot about on this channel about the military industrial base of the United States being stretched thin by the war in Ukraine, a buildup of deterrence against China over the Strait of Taiwan. Like, U.S., not just Israel, the entire U.S. industrial base is low on ammunition too. So I imagine there's political pressure to end this as well. I was wondering, do you think another reason that Netanyahu was pushing for a ceasefire was because of the ICC warrants, and he was shaken by that, and he wants to be seen as a peacemaker? What's your sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, in many respects, ending the war is ultimately when that accountability period will begin, right? And that's something that's also been stated by Israeli media. The need to hold Netanyahu for account due to the failures of October the 7th. But what's interesting is actually the way that I see this ceasefire is that it is, in many respects, the greatest strategic defeat to the Israeli occupation entity after October the 7th, is being forced to accept the ceasefire. Because accepting the ceasefire is an acknowledgement more than anything that the Israeli Project 2.0 was defeated at the hands of the Islamic resistance of Lebanon. Because if the objective of Lebanon entering the war in support of Gaza on October the 8th, 2023, was to act as a pressure lever to bring the war in Gaza to a halt, right? We said that it acted as a supporting front. Then Lebanon's objective on September the 23rd, 2024, when America greenlit that escalatory move for Netanyahu and the entity, the objective there was elevated from being that supporting front for Gaza to actually preventing Israel from securing the American quote-unquote new Middle East project that effectively hoped to actualize after, in its mind, defeating the Islamic resistance of Lebanon. As Ghadi said, like Israel was experiencing this kind of like drunken high after, assassinating, Sayyid Hassan, the pager attacks. And it hoped, or it believed, that by decapitating the head, that would kind of have a knock-on effect on the body, that would collapse also the other fronts. So remember when Netanyahu lifted that green map versus that black map? So a ceasefire is nothing more than the Israeli occupation entities saying they are unable to achieve this goal. So it is a more humiliating defeat than 2006. This was the Israeli occupation entities' last shot in a way to prove themselves to America. It's like America was in this transitionary period between two administrations. And it's like, okay, Israel, this war has gone on for several months now. Shoot your shots. That's the way that I understood the green lighting of the aggression in September. Let's see what you're capable of. You haven't managed to restore the deterrence lost on October the 7th in Gaza because you achieved nothing on the ground there. So go into Lebanon and see what you're capable of. And America was actually impressed by the assassination of Sayyid Hassan, the pager attacks, and they thought that they were getting somewhere. And that's why Netanyahu went into that kind of drunken high. But the Israeli occupation entity proved ultimately they are unable to fulfill the functional role that they exist to carry out. What's Israel's functional role? Act as a disciplinary stick, as a military stick that can target and strike any entity or country within the region that falls outside of Western dictates. It's a military base turned into a country. That's exactly what the Israeli occupation entity is. So it's exactly as you say. Israel is a society of luxury, not war. Its capabilities are above ground, not underground, so very vulnerable. There is the threat of the expansioning of the war on the fronts, which America doesn't want. And Israel has proven itself to be a sheer and utter failure. So in light of all of this, as I've kind of trying to stress over here, and that is that the failures of Israel brings it to a point where ultimately, if it decides to continue with war, if its army collapses, what's going to happen to the entity itself? It's not going to be able to sustain itself. And that's why, the Major Army Reserve General Yitzhak Brik says, if this war continues for 2 more years, we will cease to exist. We hear this kind of rhetoric. So I don't really think Netanyahu gives 2 dimes about the ICC if he was winning on the ground. If the Israeli occupation entity was able to continue on the ground, it's not like the ICC would have a bearing on whether he should continue the war or stop the war. It's the failures on the ground that leads Netanyahu to a point of desperation where they are the ones that are basically calling the shots and saying we need a ceasefire, and that is an admission of their failure and of the victory of the resistance as well. I would say that this ceasefire in and of itself, sorry, I just want to emphasize this one point because a lot of people don't see it as such, but the ceasefire is a victory for the resistance because Israel did not secure their objectives. They didn't finish the resistance. They didn't bring a new government in. And regarding fighting Israel, no one can stop or disarm the resistance, irrespective of Resolution 1701 being there since 2006. The greatest expansion of the resistance between the Litani and the South happened since 2006. So it's not the Lebanese resistance stopping the military fire and going towards the political direction. It's actually the Israeli occupation entity that's making concessions. It's not really the military wing of the resistance that's signing a ceasefire. It's effectively the Lebanese government, which, yes, the resistance is a part of the Lebanese government and doesn't want to go against it, but it's not obliged in that sense, especially given the fact that we know Israel is the type to break these resolutions. So no, the ceasefire does not mean a disarmament of the resistance, as some think. They read Resolution 1701, as Ghadi said, and assume so. Ultimately, the ceasefire has nothing to do with 1701. It's just that excuse.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that Netanyahu, well, his rhetoric is getting very tired and repetitive at this point, but he said that one of the three reasons that he accepted the ceasefire was Iran. A nuclear Iran is the greatest threat to the world, et cetera, and they need to refocus on that. He didn't say what that looks like. So I remember, like, even back in 2009, when I was still in the military, I was reading like think tank pieces by the Brookings Institute. It was called The Path to Persia, and it was all these different ideas about executing a regime change, starting with like coups to military action to using Israel as a lever. And then Section 4 was accepting the unacceptable, containing Iran, because you couldn't defeat Iran militarily. The U.S., after fighting two low intensity forever wars in West and Central Asia, couldn't do it. And you know what I'm seeing right now, which makes me think like they're going to just have to give up militarily. Something you said kind of reminded me of that. I'm pulling up a recent article written by Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, a completely ridiculous think tank that is basically a cutout for different Israeli intelligence officials and stuff. And this was published November 25th, right before the ceasefire. Like the day the ceasefire went through. It's Israel's path to victory, dismantling Khamenei's regime by 2040. To provide security for Israel is not enough to work harder at deterrence. Khamenei's deadline, the year 2040, demands a bold counter strategy, dismantle his regime. And this, I just thought it was striking because it reminds me of this Brookings Institute article I had to read when I was doing like intelligence about like, yeah, we can't really do anything to Iran militarily for a lot of complicated geopolitical reasons. So we're going to do a coup or like instigate a popular revolution. So I think that's their footing. And for me personally, based off, since I've been like looking at this issue since I was a teenager, essentially, I just don't see any different rhetoric when it comes to Iran. It's like what are you going to do at this point? Like, what is Israel going to do? Like, really? Oh, sorry. Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just saying very quickly here, that's very true, because the more the Israeli occupation entity kind of increases its goals, the more it creates a greater pit for itself. And we've seen this with Lebanon, right? It's like its failures in Gaza meant it said, okay, we need to deal with the even bigger threat, which is Lebanon, which has rendered it even weaker. So imagine coming to the, as Israel would see it, as the head of the snake, the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's like if the New Middle East project didn't work 2 decades ago when you occupied Iraq and Afghanistan and stationed troops in Pakistan to literally dismantle the structure in Iran and to reach Iran. And to ultimately, that was the whole point of the 2006 war, right? And that was the whole point of assassinating Rafiq al-Hariri in Lebanon, to pull Syria out of Lebanon, to weaken, the Islamic resistance of Lebanon, and then to go into Syria, help with the funding of Daesh, to topple the government there. That's what the whole Arab Spring was about. And then, so all of that strategy was to reach Iran. And all of that on the ground militarily failed. And it's like, what fails militarily? You think that's going to work politically? And it's, as you said, it's a strategy that they try every several few years. They try to cause this kind of upheaval. They try to unleash their undercover collaborator networks to wreak havoc. The economic sanctions is probably the biggest aspect of applying pressure on Iran, the maximum pressure campaign of Trump. I mean, if all of those things failed, seriously, like, we're at a time right now where Netanyahu thinks he can talk to the Iranian masses and convince them. It's like everyone sees you as a monster in the global north and the global south. Like seriously, what chances do you think you have right now? It's bonkers.
Yeah, well, they do pay a lot of money to talking heads in the diaspora, so that. So I think when conceptualizing Iran, over the past 20 years, I've seen the same narrative, and it existed even before I was born. That Iran is this weak post-revolutionary state that's about to fall at any moment. There's massive discontent within the Iranian population against the government, but at the same time, Harris, during her failed campaign, said that our greatest adversary on like international news was Iran, which is a bizarre statement. But okay, so it's this post-revolutionary weak state that's able to somehow destabilize the Middle East and be the United States' greatest adversary. So first of all, I mean, nothing's changed. It's just the same old talking points since before the global war on terror. How do you see the Trump presidency first impacting Israel, changing anything in terms of policy with Israel, how that will affect Gaza and Lebanon, and then go over to Iran? Do you think he will have a different policy position than the Biden administration?
Yeah, these are really good questions. But I think right before I go into that, just one of the main things that have come to my mind is the question of, okay, if America has been spending billions of dollars, as you're saying, through these kinds of NGOs, trying to spread quote unquote regime change through the soft war strategies of turning the people against the government, then why have their coups failed? And despite applying that kind of maximum pressure on the Islamic Republic of Iran, coups work when there's not a strong relationship between the people and the leadership or the ideals of the system. But in the case of Iran, it's quite an active and energetic nation. Like, they went through a lot to topple the Shah. We're talking about, those killed in the hundreds of thousands against that authoritarian dictatorship supplied to the teeth by the West. So it's not like, if the Iranian nation was truly discontented to the extent that the Americans want us to believe, then why haven't they risen up in arms? Especially if Iranians, in actual fact, are paying a price for supporting the revolution or for the system that they live under through, the economic sanctions that amounts to really economic warfare and terrorism, because it affects people in the material and tangible sense, such as, not having access to treatments, unemployment, etc., the weakening of the economy. And so this kind of alludes to us that the majority of the people in Iran, on the very least, if they have criticisms, it's directed towards revamping the system, but it's not abandoning the system of the Islamic Revolution. There is a kind of attachment between the leadership and the people that I think the West fails to grasp. So that's on that question. Moving on to Trump. Trump is a really interesting character. He would have been a catastrophe for the region if Israel was doing well on the ground, because Trump is the kind of guy to stamp all of the achievements of the Israeli occupation entity. So we know that he was the guy that brokered the Abraham Accords. The deal of the century was put forward by, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law. And so actually, if Israel was able to achieve anything on the ground, like Trump, even at one point during his election campaign, spoke about the need to thicken Israel. He was like, it's too slim. So he's the type to give them the green light, to give them the unconditional support. Let's see what you're made of. But at the same time, in the same vein, if Israel is unable to achieve anything on the ground, that means they're a failure. Trump is the kind of guy that doesn't like failures. He doesn't react well to failures. And Trump is also
losers.
Yeah. So he's quite single-minded, right? Like, he's quite moody. Like, a lot of people were worried about the fact that he's put Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz and all these like hawkish people into positions of power and cabinet around him. But I'm like, Trump has his strategy in his mind. If they're not walking along with his strategy, like what he did in his first term, he got rid of Rex Tillerson and he put Mike Pompeo in power. So that's the kind of guy that Trump is. Trump is like, when it comes to political trade and negotiation, that's his thing. It wasn't like Trump didn't want an agreement with Iran. Trump had a problem with the JCPOA from an egotistical perspective. It's like, I want a Trump deal. I don't want an Obama deal. And so Trump even went out of his way to kind of seek a kind of compromise with Iran. At one point, I think it was 2019, if I remember correctly, he sent a letter through the mediator who was the Japanese PM. So he sent the Japanese PM to meet Sayyid Ali Khamenei to give him a message, a letter actually. And then Sayyid Ali Khamenei put that letter, beneath his chair saying, we're not interested in responding to this. Trump is the guy. I warned, the West cannot be trusted. America cannot be trusted. He came and he tore the JCPOA. So Trump is the kind of guy that would want to kind of settle a compromise that's like in America's favor from an economic and trade perspective. Trump is not really pro-military wars on the ground. I think that's clear. That's obvious what his inclination towards that is. Like, he would prefer to mend ties with Russia than to see this war continue, which in part explains why the Biden administration and the American deep state is going in the direction of further, prompting Ukraine to use ballistic missiles to target Russia, to kind of set that scene for when Trump does come into power, to make it more difficult for Trump. So I think when it comes to Iran, like, Trump's proved that, okay, the way to deal with an entity like Iran, or even Lebanon, for that matter, even Syria, he was the one that introduced the Caesar sanctions in Syria, the maximum pressure campaign also into Lebanon. And even when it comes to the Israeli occupation entity, his strategy was the deal of the century and the Abraham Accords. That's all about creating a kind of economic integration between the West and the Arab states, leveraging the presence of the Israeli occupation entity. So rather than it being this kind of military base that can just strike, it's like, let's use you more for investment purposes. So I think Trump is the kind of guy that he looks at the power balance on the ground, and he looks at the strong and the effective forces, and he thinks, what can we get out of this? Or what are the American interests here? So there's more practicality and there's more pragmatism to Trump, which I know sounds really, it sounds like a paradox here. But Trump, if he sees that you're failing on the ground, he doesn't respond well. He tends where the power balance goes. He's not a proponent of the two-state solution either. So, and which is a failing solution anyways.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good counterpoint to him being against any solution. Well, it's not going to work in the first place. So
it's going to work in the first place. Yeah. Exactly. So there's a sense of pragmatism there. But when it comes to Iran, I'm not entirely clear on what Trump's strategy in the second term is. Is he going to go again for that maximum pressure campaign? I mean, we saw the IAEA anti-resolution that was passed by the Europeans, so France, UK, Germany, which was all about kind of raising the tune of political confrontation at a higher level. It's almost like Europe is now signaling they don't want to be held to the details of the nuclear agreement, which I do believe in many respects is a prelude to justifying the return back to the maximum pressure campaign, which, as we've been saying, was like Trump's primary strategy in his first term. He's not a fan of conventional wars. So that being a part of getting along with the new administration's policy and the overall war in Iran. So I think also the ways that Israel can potentially act up against Iran, that's something that you mentioned. That's one of the points that I emphasized in this ceasefire, is through maxing out its security penetration, further assassination on generals, again, trying to create a stumbling block for the nuclear agreement, again, wreaking havoc internally. You've discussed this, unleashing their collaborator networks, but it's doomed, because these are all policies that they're tried and tested policies. It's like, okay, you went into Lebanon to ground invade again in 2024, as though you didn't get a good spanking in 2006, as though you didn't have to withdraw in 2000. It's crazy that they're coming back to the same strategies all of these 2.5 decades later, when the resistance is so much stronger, and the components that actually Israel has developed in the intelligence sphere, in the sphere of causing mass destruction, those are the two main areas that Israel reigns supreme in its air force and its ability to penetrate in terms of intelligence, and also the media. They have the upper hand in their control over the media. But those are not the components that make you win on the ground. The components of morale, the morale has only deteriorated. Ghadi went into this, so I won't go into it myself. But yeah, the components are not there. The world is shifting to another place. I feel like October the 7th, 2023, was that turning point in which all of the masks of deception have fallen. So it's crazy when I see Netanyahu sitting there trying to speak to the Iranian population as though they can take him seriously and not see through it.
I mean, the same thing happened in Lebanon. He said explicitly, quote, Hezbollah puts rockets and missiles in every kitchen, in every living room. It's like, how do you get a ballistic missile with a 14-foot wingspan into your the second foot story, you building them in there, and so he thinks he's speaking to the Lebanese people. We're not fighting you, we're fighting Hezbollah. And of course, that's not for the Lebanese people. It's for people in America and people in Britain to hear that and be like, okay, yeah, Israel's, they're just fighting against terrorism, which has become a completely racial slur that's used as a cudgel by the great powers to condemn violence that goes against their interests in the region. So I think, do you think Iran then, given the certain the strategic positioning of all these different players, will do anything? Will intervene in any way? Because I do think the IRGC, unless I'm mistaken, put out a statement that said, they will respond to Israel's latest airstrikes against military targets in Iran at a time and date of their choosing. Do you see that actually happening, or?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So in terms of happening, yes, like it's happening. In fact, Iran's tone recently has been quite strong. I think the chief of the Iranian armed forces, I read this before yesterday, this was right before the ceasefire was announced, stated that Iran's response would be beyond the imagination of the entity. So Iran's evaluation for when it wants to strike, it always depends on the circumstances. They choose the appropriate time. Operation True Promise 2, if we remember, I think it was on the 3rd of October. It came about when the entity had no expectation for it. I think in September, that's when the US warships had withdrew. They were like almost standing in one leg in the region, preempting that Iran would strike, because I think they killed Hani in the end of July. So all of August until September, they were preempting it. So by the time Operation True Promise 2 came, there was no expectation for it. But Iran has proved one thing through Operation True Promise 1 and 2, and that is that its sovereignty is a red line. So that is that, rest assured, there will be retaliation as an equation, at least like for like. But I will say that the last Israeli attacks, they were quite minuscule. It almost amounted to zero compared to the damage that Iran inflicted on the entity, targeting the 5 bases. And the attacks, so the Israeli attacks also indicated that Iran succeeded, because they were quite minuscule, in achieving a significant deterrence equation in its factor. So it actually created a kind of fear in the occupation entity of an impactful strike. And we saw that the way that Israel was taking out its revenge on not being able to strike Iran in a meaningful fashion was by, ratcheting up its striking in Lebanon and Gaza. This was last month. And this indicates to us, all of this indicates that the Israeli occupation entity is taking the potential Iranian strike quite seriously. And so the US and Israel are seriously considering the Iranian strategy and its influence in the region. Iran has broader deterrence options in other fronts as well. This is an important point. The resistance axis is made up of 7 fronts. 7 fronts are fighting against the Israeli occupation entity. So the support and the cohesion that Iran provides to the resistance axis is the most important role that it can play. Iran's real response, if we want to look at its real response, is to continue its strategy in support of the entire axis, because this is what will lead to the dismantling of the Israeli occupation entity. And Iran places this retaliation card in its pocket in terms of that striking, and plays it when and as they see fit within their interest. But this is an important point that we have to understand, that also Sayyid Ali Khamenei has been emphasizing quite a bit, and he said this before yesterday in his speech, and that was that expect the resistance axis to expand, the fronts to expand with time. So in actual fact, what we're seeing with time is a kind of accumulation of resistance capabilities on the ground. Jordan is an example of where, Israel is placing its attention on. I believe last month, the occupation forces announced the formation of a new division bordering the West Bank and Jordan out of fear of the smuggling of weapons into the West Bank. You have a Jordanian MP, I think his name was Imad Adwan, who was arrested not long ago for smuggling weapons into the West Bank. And he used his diplomatic passport to do that. So, the people in Jordan have an appetite for the resistance. So it's important that we look beyond just this current phase of confrontation between the occupation entity, Lebanon, Gaza. Think beyond the immediate. The scope of the resistance axis is to rid the whole region of imperialism. So irrespective of the ceasefire agreement, the resistance is still seeking an expansion of its fronts and its capabilities, and this does not stop with a ceasefire. It's going in the direction of accumulation, and not everything has to be seen with the eyes. So the Lebanese resistance, for example, now it has the time to maintain, to restructure, to recuperate, and that phase of maintenance is as important, if not more, than the actual striking on the battlefield. And I think actually it was yesterday that Netanyahu said something along the lines of, Bashar al-Assad is playing with fire, which I understood to mean potentially the Islamic resistance of Lebanon using Syria as a ground to launch, So the whole resistance axis, it's one front. Israel, as I've mentioned, is facing 7 of those fronts. It's not just Lebanon. So each part of the resistance axis has a role to play in coordination with the passage of time. So also this idea of like the separation of the fronts is just not a reality. That's what the Israeli occupation entity wants people to believe, to put forward as though it's a kind of like objective that they have achieved. But the resistance axis will never separate the fronts. Why? Because it's a foundational strategy. If they agree to a ceasefire, then it's a tactical move within the higher interest of the resistance axis that is fully coordinated, may I add. So today, all of the fronts, we saw, Hamas, the PIJ, we saw the Ansar Allah, we saw the Islamic Republic of Iran, we saw Syria, we saw the Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq, all of them, the West Bank as well, sending their congratulations to the Islamic resistance of Lebanon on the ceasefire. So Lebanon cannot take such an agreement, like going forward with the ceasefire, if the other fronts don't agree. And if there is a kind of intervention that is deemed necessary, then you have the closest front in the axis that will intervene to support the one that is in the battlefront if there is a need for that. And no front is allowed to fall, period. So October the 8th demonstrated that for us. Lebanon's intervention to act as a supporting front demonstrated to us that no part of the axis will be left alone if it's critical. So if Lebanon's resistance, for example, let's say hypothetically, was really under threat, we would see Iran being the next line of defense of direct intervention in the same way that Lebanon has been to Gaza. So I think it's important that we wrap our heads around this logic. If tomorrow there's a ceasefire in Gaza and the Israeli massacres begin in the West Bank, if the Gazan resistance doesn't directly get involved in the West Bank, it doesn't mean Gaza's abandoning the West Bank. Just because we've been used to a strategy for some time, it doesn't mean that its consistent application in every period of time is within the highest strategic interest. So if anyone thinks that the leadership of the resistance can take a shot to split the fronts, they're mistaken. A leader in the resistance has no such power. They are then the leader of another resistance party or any other party, not the Islamic resistance of Lebanon, because strategically the fronts will and cannot separate. It's not difficult to understand that post Sayyid Nasrallah is another phase of war. Interests are assessed in each phase. The phase pre was, okay, we're acting as a supporting front for Gaza. The phase post his assassination has been an open confrontation with Israel, where we're talking about literally thwarting the new Middle East project that Israel has put forward. So on that basis, has the resistance won? Yes, because Israel has failed in advancing in that goal. It hasn't even dismantled the resistance in Lebanon and its weapons capabilities, let alone had the ability to expand regionally and to consolidate a new 1948, basically. And I will also emphasize one last thing, and that's the fragmentation to come post-war for Israel is even greater in victory terms than stopping the war itself. What is to come within Israel is great in terms of the entity eating itself up.
We've been saying that for the past year, and I don't understand. I patently don't understand why people like strategists and analysts can't see like the basic foundational doctrine that if you set a bunch of objectives and you don't achieve them, you fail. Like it's kind of like mind-boggling. And I just wanted to point out that one final point, just from a operational level, in a distance conflict, Iran wins every time. Because they have a massive ballistic missile arsenal. Israel has a really tiny one. And in order to strike Iranian targets, they have to literally refuel over Iraqi airspace on the way back, which is why we saw like 10 Strato fortresses, which are U.S. Air Force tankers, go dark on their transponder chips over Cyprus right before the attack happened. So there's just not a capability to attack Iran. So when Netanyahu says something like, we are accepting a ceasefire in Lebanon in order to focus on Iran, and then you have the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy saying, like, we've got 15 years to do a regime change. They're basically just treading water because they have nowhere to go. They have nowhere to go. And the political apparatus in Washington is such, because it's compromised, and also there's an element of just how imperialism operates as a dynamic, they can't afford to back down. They're not going to back down until defeated, like Vietnam, and they're not going to back down in Ukraine until they're defeated and they can't do it anymore. So there's really no way out, but we're going to keep going forward with wars because that's what we do. We've shifted from the age of direct U.S. involvement on the ground because there's a massive recruiting crisis. The U.S. Public doesn't have enough manufactured consent or the political will for another direct action conflict. So we're going to keep doing these proxy wars. We've got Israel, we've got Ukraine, and we've got Taiwan. So do you have time for a couple questions? We've got 5 minutes left.
Yeah, go for it.
We like to, and since you're coming from the UK, hopefully you know what's going on. Anyone know the status of Richard Medhurst? Last I heard, his court date was delayed.
Oh, I don't know the status of Richard Medhurst, but he hasn't been as active as you'd expect him to be. Yeah. I've not really been seeing him on Twitter as much.
Yeah, you guys have some crazy counterterrorism laws.
It's worse than the United States. It's worse if you read it.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, when you get stopped in airports, this is in particular, we have what's known as Schedule 7, which I believe Richard was stopped under, and many others as well. Tens of, not even activists, just like normal people. It's an intimidation tactic. Especially Muslims are stopped, is to create this kind of atmosphere and environment of fear-mongering where basically you get detained interim, you get questioned, and you're not allowed to not answer. So if you don't answer, you can be, formally taken in and charged in a way for not answering. But yeah, there is a lot of clamping down when it comes to speaking the truth. There's a real war when it comes to the media narrative, and that's because they're losing the media narrative. That's why they feel so desperate.
Yeah. Well, I mean, would you say that they've lost the narrative forever? I don't see how they get it back. Like all of these decades and decades of like the generation of pro-Israel information operations, these entire media apparatus that they've created, both not just in the press, but in academic institutions, etc. It's all going away. How do they get it back? Because that's the main thing that's protected Israel for so long.
So true. And that explains why they spend billions of dollars, well, the lobbies at least, and they spend billions of dollars on the media machine. It's like the fourth leg of the capitalist establishment. And if it's not media, they find other ways to distract you, through entertainment industries, through Hollywood, through creating this kind of shallow consumerist society. It's all as a weapon of distraction. So either they're like tainting the way that you think through propaganda, so you don't get to see the truth, or it's through means of mass distraction of society. But the blood that's been given on the ground is too grand in magnitude to not shake the world. I think that's the only way that you can explain it. The sacrifices are beyond comprehension, that you cannot be shaken and you cannot just not be moved. And I think that explains why you're seeing a whole movement within, especially the younger generation, which the establishment is very afraid of. So, for example, Palestine Action, that sprouted from the UK, that's spreading. I believe there is even a branch in the US where people are literally willing to put their own bodies on the line to sacrifice their liberty, knowing very well that they may end up in prison. And we do have at least 10 Palestine Action political prisoners in the UK in order to disrupt the weapons supply. I mean, that comes from a place of really just not being able to internally live in such a polluted society. It's like the discontentment is so huge, you can't turn a blind eye to what's happening you'd rather put yourself in harm's way, you know.
Yeah.
So the tides are changing.
They really are. 5 years before South African apartheid was dismantled, nobody thought it could ever change. So things are happening faster now. So, and basically they can't restore their military deterrence capacity, and they can't restore their grip on the media and academic institutions like they could anymore. They've lost the entire generation. So really appreciate you coming on. We're at the hour mark. Thank you so much.
Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So Batool Subeiti, and then we had Ghadi Francis on earlier. This is State of Play on Mint Press News. And if you're just coming in at the tail end, because I still see people filtering in, you missed it, but you can replay it. We're talking about the Lebanon ceasefire and how people were confused about it, but you shouldn't be that confused about it because it's pretty simple. It's not looking good from the Israeli United States perspective. Thank y'all so much. Tomorrow's Thanksgiving. It's, if you're living in the United States, it's just something you have to do, I guess, because we do it. It whitewashes, a completely horrendous settler colonial history. And, if you want to spice things up, you can tell your conservative white uncle about all of that, and I'm sure he will go into an apoplectic fit of existential rage / despair. So, challenge for you tomorrow, and we will see you Monday. Thanks, y'all.